Today's guest is joining us for the second time. Mitch Presnick is a visiting fellow of practice at Harvard University's Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, founder of Super 8 Hotels China, an economy hotel chain with more than 1,100 locations, and APCO Worldwide China, that's APCO Worldwide China, a public affairs firm. Presnick studied at Peking University and Rutgers Business School and has spent 35 years in Beijing and Hong Kong. Welcome back to the bridge, Mitch.
Hey, Jason. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your time in Hong Kong today. So obviously, you have a great knowledge of business, and you are an old hand of China. By the way, I wanted to ask, have you heard this term, old hand of China?
Sure, old China hand. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Most folks from my generation were not keen on that term because it was usually something we used to criticize like people that that were I think there's a lot of inherent modesty in the whole China scholarship thing. So people that actually do understand China from the West rarely ever would call themselves a China hand. I certainly always cringe when I hear it. I mean, China specialist, I guess. But yeah, I mean, the whole idea that it means like you're an old hand. It means that you can, that you can walk in and you have it all figured out. And the truth is, the longer you spend in China, the more you realize you don't have anything figured out, man.
This show's producer, a local Chinese lady, loved your description of 1980s China, by the way. She went off on it the next day. She's like, wow, that was just exactly how it really was. She's just, you're describing, the women draped on the back of the bicycle, sitting sideways behind their man with their arms around them. And she loved it. So we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Beijing in the 1980s through, your perception.
Every decade in China has its own charms. I think in many ways the 80s were the most charming of all, though. I think it's hard to really describe the feeling in Beijing, but remember, Deng Xiaoping's 改革开放 policy started in 78. So by the time I arrived in the 80s, there was so much optimism in China and it was everywhere. Even though, the hardware wasn't that impressive, the third ring road had not yet been built in China, so it was all, in Beijing rather, it was all, it was all, traffic lights all the way through what is now the third ring road. There was no fourth ring or fifth ring, it was just everything was different, man. Like the Coca-Cola was room temperature. Coca-Cola had to come up with a whole advertising campaign to encourage people to ice their beverages, and it was Bing Le Yiho Gong Shi Coco. All right, that was like Coca-Cola. So I mean, there was nothing available that we were familiar with other than if you went to the friendship store and you could get some bread, which was pretty good, and cheese and sausage. But there was really very little that one could come into China and recognize as a foreigner. But that's what made it so cool. Like it was like landing on a different planet. You were just, showing up at a place with no fast food restaurants, with very few cars, with, the people were just very, very sincere, and like the way that they would talk and interact, they were not too busy. Nobody was too busy to talk. They were all, especially if you were a foreigner showing up, they had a lot of time because they were so curious. When we would go traveling, and this was like major towns near Beijing, the whole town would shut down whenever we would show up there. Like it wasn't like now where foreigners are a dime a dozen. It was a really, really interesting experience to be a foreigner in China in the 80s. And it was a magnificent feeling because everything was new, everything was discovery. There was so much optimism. And then every year you could see demonstrable improvements in the quality of life that everybody was enjoying. And so I think that's kind of what made it special. It was just a totally different China than the China that you see now. And the fact that it went from that to where we are now is even more impressive. And that's what I think is really hard. There's a lot of, China specialists that have been involved in China for, 10, 15, 20 years. they have no idea of like when they de-emphasize the achievement that China made getting here. Whatever you think about China, if not giving them credit for what they've achieved is just the silliest thing I've ever heard. But they can't, because if they give credit to China for those things, then somehow they feel they're sort of depreciating their own position, or they're somehow by not saying something negative about China, they're going to be accused of being a panda hugger or whatever. But one can objectively acknowledge reality. Well, that's what we do in business. I mean, the whole idea is to get away from the emotion, right? To get away from the bias, and to get away from all the things that are driving the conversation. Now, it's why business people need to be in the conversation, because the ones that I knew, the business people that I knew in the 80s who are still around, I mean, at least whatever they think about China today, they acknowledge that going from where it was in the 80s to where it is now is just objectively impressive, right? And that's kind of a lot of what I'm trying to do is bring a little more of that objective reality back to this conversation.
We're also interested in Hong Kong, because of the Greater Bay Area. What year did you move to Hong Kong?
So I moved to Hong Kong in August of 1990.
Wow. So,
yeah.
Well, I guess that was also another golden period, because maybe this is just my wife's bias talking, but every great movie from Hong Kong was made between like 1985 and 1995. So she's constantly making me watch these old Hong Kong movies from that period of time. So what was Hong Kong like coming from, well, firstly, yeah, two questions. What was Hong Kong like coming from Beijing? And then what was Hong Kong like in the early 90s?
Coming from Beijing, when I was in my first year at Beida, one of my classmates was an African guy from Zambia, and he had some VHS tapes, which were, in the time before time. It's how we watched movies. We recorded them on this videotape recorder, and then we could, play them back. And that was kind of a neat thing in the days before, CDs and DVDs and that sort of thing. So he had a bunch of recordings that were, English movies in English, and they were all from Hong Kong. So we all thought that Hong Kong was already this mystical place, right? It was a place that was very much an English-speaking colony. Cantonese, obviously, primarily, but it was heavily English as well. So all of the Europeans and the Americans and the Aussies, we all loved going to Hong Kong, because after a while, Chinese language and everything else, it was a little overwhelming for students, right? So we loved the opportunity to go to Hong Kong once every 6 months or a year and have all that experience. But Hong Kong was just this very cool, exotic place, because it was like this little outpost of what is now like the G7, but it was in Asia, right? It was the only place like it. I mean, you had places that were cool and interesting and modern. Tokyo was sort of the place that we all thought of when we thought of like this, uber modern city. But Hong Kong was also just, it was muscular and it was fast and it was like mountains and sea. And so we loved it. And not to mention, Hong Kong GDP at that time was about 25% of China's GDP. So it wasn't just a city, it was like a mega economic power, and we all knew it. And I mean, the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, it had more influence than the American Chamber of Commerce in China in those days. And and Hong Kong Chinese, when they were in China, they had money, they had English and Chinese, and they had the fashion, and they were the cool kids, and their movies were the coolest. Wang Fei was this, I don't know if you remember who that is, but there was some, Wang Fei, and there was a bunch of, Jackie Chung and a lot of these Hong Kong movie stars and singers were just super popular everywhere in China and in Asia. So that was, it was really the Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong was really the New York of Asia back then. It felt like it had major swagger, and when you showed up there, it was intimidating because it was expensive and crowded, and and everybody was showing up. It was like the cantina in Star Wars. It had everybody was there, and we're all trying to figure it out. I showed up with, $800 in my pocket, and I had to find a job. I had a wool suit. It was August. Like I had a winter weight suit. It was, I could afford to live in Chungking Mansions, which is this infamous hostel on Nathan Road in Kowloon. And, basically it was everything I could do to just try to hold it together and pray that I could get a job before I ran out of money. Because I did have a one-way air ticket to go back to the U.S. in case I couldn't figure it out. But in the 90s, although lots of people showed up in Hong Kong to try to get work, the ones that were really getting the work in those days were the British citizens, because they could show up and they had an automatic 1-year visa just upon landing, and they could work or do whatever as British citizens. And any member of the Commonwealth, they had certain advantages. The U.S. and our countrymen, we didn't have such advantages, and we had to get work visas, and we had to get companies to sponsor us. And it was a thing. I lived with a missionary family. They were Seventh-day Adventists, and they were really sweet to me. But they like put me up for 6 months in their apartment at the Hong Kong Adventist Hospital. They had, they were both doctors, and I got to live with them rent-free for a few months because I couldn't afford to pay the deposit on an apartment. So so that was sort of like how it was for a lot of us. Most of us showed up. If we didn't have a job showing up, it was basically just trying to get any job. And the job I ended up taking, I was basically paid as a clerk by American Airlines. They gave me an analyst title, but it was basically a clerk's job. And I was making I think it was 8,800 Hong Kong dollars a month when you figured in everything, which is, just a little over $1,000. This is, mind you, after earning an undergraduate degree, having student loans, and 2 years at Beida, and now I'm basically working for a secretary salary. And that was how I started. That was what a lot of people did, but it was worth it. It was so cool to be in Hong Kong in those days. They had so many traditions around the whole expat lifestyle that they had developed over 100 years, right? So cricket and Chinese, leisure junk boats where you'd go out on a Saturday and drink wine all afternoon and then go somewhere and have these great Chinese seafood meals out of the outlying islands. This was our life, and everybody was coming to Hong Kong in those days, and it was considered the coolest place in the world to be, and everyone wanted to be there. Everyone wanted to come and visit, and so that's what it was like. The time in the run up from 1990 to 1997 was some of the coolest time in Hong Kong. But I still think it was better after the handover. But we can talk about that next.
I guess you are studying, even from the United States now, China's economy, and over the last, I guess, 5 years, really more like 10. China has gone to great lengths to integrate Hong Kong into this idea, the Greater Bay Area, using infrastructure and ideas and legal mobility, bridges, subways, high-speed rail, and more. I mean, I can take a train from Beijing directly to Hong Kong now. So my question is, do you think this increased integration is leading to regional economic gains? What are the benefits of this infrastructure? What is China trying to do, and what is it actually accomplishing?
So looking at the Greater Bay Area, the first thing that strikes is, if you want to compare it to other economic areas, it's number 2 in the world, right? It's number 2. New York metropolitan area is number 1 in terms of economic value. It's something like 2.2 trillion, and the economic value of the Greater Bay Area is 1.9 or coming up towards 2 trillion. So it's now surpassed San Francisco. It's surpassed Tokyo in the greater Tokyo area. So the economic value is enormous, right? So you want to be part of that. If you're in that area, you do not want to be separated from it, right? So that's the first thing. I think mainland China realized that since Hong Kong is already on its own little track, it's, you know, one country, two systems, right? So it's operating under a different system, different legal structure. They use common law. They have foreign judges. There's more judicial independence in Hong Kong. We can debate how much more, but there's a lot more in Hong Kong than there is in China. So there's a lot of reasons why Hong Kong could be treated separately. But what you really want, if you're China, is you want to bring the benefits of where Hong Kong is unique into China, because Hong Kong is still the primary clearance platform for renminbi international exchange, right? And remember, China now trades more than half of its total volume in renminbi. So that's a very important status. Like, I don't think people really understand. People constantly underestimate what makes Hong Kong unique. Not least of which is Hong Kong people. Like, Hong Kong people are constantly feeling sheepish or insecure about what made Hong Kong such a great city, because they think it's all because that they've been very good at serving whoever was their senior, whether it was the British or now China. And the truth of the matter is, Hong Kong has always been like scrappy and intrepid and very good at cost control and very good at trading. The challenge with Hong Kong right now is it's connected to China, obviously, and China dominates global manufacturing and trade. That was always Hong Kong's traditional strength, was trade, right? But it was trade specifically from China to the world, from the world to China, and it was sort of that window. It was a little bit of a entree pot for those sorts of trading relationships. But on the finance side, which is Hong Kong's other primary claim to fame, that is a connection that it has into the international payment system and SWIFT, and the US dollar is reserve currency. So it really is in a bit of a unique situation where it has to be now aligned to its country, but it also has to serve an international community that wants to have a place within China that they can feel like it's kind of theirs or a little more comfortable. For the folks that have taken the time, like you and me, to learn the language and learn the history and delve 12 levels deep into China, Beijing, Chongqing, wherever you choose, that's where we're comfortable. But for people that don't speak Chinese, right, and for people that sort of want to have one foot in the Western world and one foot in China, Hong Kong was always the place to do that. And it was a very easy place to be in that regard, and it didn't require an enormous amount of effort to get comfortable and to make Hong Kong one's own. So that's really the change now, is that it's that Hong Kong has to straddle these two worlds, and its role within GBA is just a part of that, right? That's like it will absolutely have a place for itself. Monaco is a great example of like a very small place in Europe that kind of has an outsized influence because it attracts so many very high net worths, and because it's such a dramatic place and there's just a lot of quality and stability there. That's always kind of been Hong Kong's backup. If it's not going to be the New York of Asia, at the very least, it's going to be, the Monaco of China, right? And if you're mainland Chinese and you have money and you don't want to get too far away from the motherland, that's where you go, because everything is familiar, because you can easily move back and forth. Like you said, you can go directly from Beijing to Hong Kong now by train. You can go from Hong Kong to anywhere now. And Hong Kongers are finally starting to discover that there's this huge hinterland that they have access to, right? And I've always felt that the best thing about being from Hong Kong isn't necessarily that one has to live in Hong Kong, but if you grow up in Hong Kong, like all the local Hong Kongers do, then they can go anywhere in China and they bring something unique. They bring a unique mindset to anything they're doing in China, and it does make them, I think, special. Yeah, still now, and maybe even more so.
Wow. Well, the last time we spoke, you talked about the competitiveness of Chinese companies, how, maybe competing in China is a great way to increase, like practice fighting because they're so competitive. So my question is, a lot of international companies like McDonald's, it's largely a US company, but it's really an international company. You know, my question is there a place for them in China? Is there a place for American and Chinese companies to compete in the same markets, whether it's in China, whether it's internationally?
Yeah, I think so. Couple things. Number one, yes, the answer is absolutely. There is a place for foreign companies in China, and there are foreign companies that do very well in China and have done very well in China and will continue to do very well in China. I mean, let's be honest, a lot of Western companies have lost a step in the last few years. GM used to make much more in China than they made in the U.S. That's not the case anymore. Apple has seen their sales slow pretty significantly. That goes to Tesla. But the companies that are hoping to be globally competitive have to compete in China, period. Like, I mean, yes, you could argue that you need to make money in China because there's reasons why that you can't deny that volume of revenue. If you don't grab that volume of revenue in China, then a Chinese company will either take it or one will be created that will take it. And then they're going to come at you in third party markets. They're going to come at you in the global South or even in your home market like the US as Temu did to Amazon. Amazon was in China in the early 2000s. And they acquired a local company and they established a bunch of distribution centers, but they never really went all in. And so they eventually decided to leave. They were like, all right, we're losing money and there's too much investment here and the local competitors are getting too tough. They thought they were making a good decision. Well, what ended up happening was Pinduoduo and Shein came onto the scene and they disrupted the e-commerce companies that were disintermediating Amazon, and then they got disrupted. And then those companies that had disrupted Jundui and Alibaba, they come to the U.S. and they started eating Amazon's lunch. And now Amazon considers Pinduoduo and Shein to be, more of a competitive threat than even Walmart, which was always Amazon's, most concerning competitor. So that's the kind of thing that you have to really look at. I think it's overly primitive to look at these things in terms of a Chinese company coming to the U.S. or an American company going to China. All of these mindsets are sort of like the whole Cold War mindset. They just don't belong in the 21st century, Jason. They're going to negatively impact the country that still holds those outdated views. They're not going to benefit. And that's the litmus test, right? If you're going to be a foreign company in China, you've got to have a mindset which is going to allow you to really understand how to be competitive now and in the future in your home market, in the China market, in third-party markets. So this whole notion, like, decoupling is an absurdly silly conversation to have. First of all, it's impossible. And second of all, it's not the right conversation for these guys. Businesses are Darwinian wonders. They can evolve and change and grow and be relevant in any environment, right? And when they're not bogged down by things that they're not really good at, like trying to evaluate national security risks and that sort of thing, where they have to just sort of defer to their host government, and they want to be patriotic, as we all do. We all want to be a patriot to our country, whether you're Chinese or American or whoever. The problem is you try to do that, you end up hurting your own company's interests, right? And that's what I'm trying to do now, is help American companies and Chinese companies kind of navigate this new era that we're in, because it's not like the old days where things were so easily defined. Like, okay, if you're an American bank and you're in Hong Kong, you've got a franchise and you'll be able to make money this way. I mean, we're talking about companies that weren't really anywhere in the year 2000 and now make up the majority of the Fortune Global 500. China now has more companies in the Fortune Global 500 than the United States does, up from 11 in 2003 to now like 141 or something. I mean, in 20 years to go from 11, that's an 1100% increase, whereas the US has lost almost 30% of its companies in the Fortune Global 500. So that's the story. Like the story is not American companies in China or Chinese companies in America. It's a story of how does a company stay relevant on technology? How do you stay relevant in pricing power? How do you stay relevant in third-party markets? These are the things that companies need to be considering. And the advantage China has is that, of course, BRI, people constantly miss this. BRI, it's an advertising campaign for Chinese companies in the global south. Like every one of those countries that's a member of BRI, with it comes along standards, nomenclatures, measurements, all of the other things that allow a company, whatever the company, name your company. You can, pick one, BYD, pick Neo, pick, Hanwei, Huawei rather. Pick any company you want from China. They're now looking at how do they develop a global business, right?
Mm.
That's the deal. It's not about, you have to have, if you want to be sort of a major company, it helps to have a major home market that you can use as a base so that you can generate a lot of your demand from your own domestic market. That provides a lot of cushion. And then you use the benefits of having a large enough home market to go out into the world and develop these world-beating companies. And the U.S. did this very successfully in the 20th century. And if you look at the composition of global GDP that the U.S. held after World War II, it was about 50% of global GDP. Now it's like 22%. But if you include the aggregate revenue of the American members of the Fortune Global 1000, that adds another 24% or so. So you what you have is American companies and the U.S. together account for almost half of global GDP when you account for it that way. So it's still quite relevant. Companies are really what this is all about. It's, as much as everyone likes to talk about politics. I mean, obviously, I say this because I'm not political, and I'm quite apolitical. Actually, I think there's enough politics for others to focus on. I focus on business, but business is the real story. Business is, over time, not national security and who has the biggest army. It's going to be who has the best companies, who has the best technology for those companies, who has the best public-private partnerships where you're harnessing the entire country's resources the way China has done. Whatever you want to say about collectivism or how you feel about their system, the Chinese system is just extremely good at vertical integration, where they can get everybody around key national goals. It's not always about how much money you're making this year, next year. You can afford to get everybody around a goal that might take 10 or 20 years to bear fruit. But then once it bears fruit, you've got a franchise and you've got a moat. And that's what China has done incredibly well with things like rare earths and now EVs and clean tech and other things, where they've gotten everybody, academia, military, government, corporates, both private enterprise and also SOEs. They've gotten everybody around those things. And, I'm quite envious. I think the U.S. Needs to have an answer to that. It can't just be about coping and talking about Chinese numbers aren't real. It can't be just this nonsense. Like, I mean, we can't field a team that won't even acknowledge that we've lost a step. You've got to basically do what the Chinese did, which is you start by saying, all right, we had our century of humiliation. Now we're going to build back stronger. And they had a plan, and they followed their plan. And that's what we need to be doing now.
There were so many ideas in that 10 minutes. Do you teach students? Because if you do, I'm incredibly envious. I wish I could be in that class. Um, wow. There's so much to think about in that response. I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to that a couple of times. So what do you think about China? You know, this keeps coming up over and over again. It's a new talking point. China's middle class. You know, a lot of people say China has 400 million people in its middle class. By 2035, it's going to be 800 million. You know, is this a reason for international companies to look at the Chinese market to get in for those companies that have not yet got a foothold in China's market? Is this a very good reason for European, for American, for the developing world to get into the Chinese market, for the possibility that Chinese consumers are going to be frantically buying products in the next 10 years? What do you think about that? Or, there's also the opposite argument that Chinese are such good savers that it's hard to get money out of their hands. So what do you make of it?
Well, let's take the last point first. So, yeah, Chinese are great savers, but they also, like any consumer, they will spend more when they're feeling more flush and feeling more confident, and they'll spend less when they're feeling less confident. And China doesn't really have a fully developed social safety net. It doesn't have like any kind of pro-owner, well, pro-controlling user land reform. In other words, if you could be sitting on land that your family has farmed for 500 years, but there's a good chance you probably don't have a lease on that land. So you can't mortgage it, you can't borrow against it, you can't rent it out to someone else easily without possibly losing it. So there's a lot of, I mean, you can do the latter probably, but the first two are relatively difficult or impossible because you don't own the deed on the property. So that's why, I mean, that's why Chinese aren't spending right now. Like, they will spend when some of that filters through. They will spend more, I think. Right now they're spending less because they're coming out of COVID. There's definitely some uncertainty. Look, China is no longer in the Deng Xiaoping reform era. Like, I mean, I remember the Deng Xiaoping reform era, and it was all about to get rich is glorious, and white cats and black cats killing mice, and it's good cats, and all this stuff. That's gone. Like, you don't hear that anymore. Now, I'm not saying that it couldn't come back, or I'm not even saying that there wasn't a need for the pendulum to swing a little bit back. But the fact is that doesn't exist anymore. If you want to get Chinese to spend, it would be helpful to give them some of that feeling of confidence and openness in the future. And right now at the very least, we're in a period of time where there's a lot of uncertainty around some of that. And, there's two arguments on this, right? One argument is that China has already, taken a big chunk out of some of the major reforms that it needed to undertake, that the model that China was using had to evolve. It wasn't going to stay an economic growth model based on property development and infrastructure investment and so forth. It had to switch to a middle class consumer economy that was growing and that people felt flush, and it would become more and more about services that professionals could offer to one another: accounting services, consulting services, life coaching services, medical services, and whatever else. All of those higher value add services. China actually does generate about something like 50% or a little more than 50% of its GDP from that bucket now. But compared to the US, which is like around 75, 80, obviously it's much lower. China will feel much more flush when it gets into, say, the 60% range. That extra 10% will make a big difference. And I think it'll feel a lot different when they get there. So let's talk about the middle class now. The Chinese middle class, first of all, because purchasing power parity, middle class in China is a far more optimistic middle class than people give them credit for. I mean, we see it all the time in our properties. Like, our trends are pretty strong because we serve a primarily middle class guest, right, at Super 8. We're even though we're an economy brand, but we're upper economy, and we attract a lot of people who maybe when they're traveling on their own dime, they may not want to stay at the Hilton or the Hyatt. They want to stay to Super 8 because it's respectable, it's safe, free breakfast and all that stuff, so they like it. And our room rate used to cost less than just the internet fee that a five-star hotel would charge. I remember there were hotels in China like in the 2007, 2008 range that were charging 150, 200 renminbi just for the internet service, right? And we were charging in many cases like 130, 150 for the entire room, which included everything. So the middle class in China are used to getting a great deal. They don't even consider a great deal to be anything special. If it's not a great deal, they won't spend. And right now, I think that's kind of where the Chinese middle class is right now. They're in this period where, first of all, they've watched their property values reduce, which was going to happen. Like, it was inevitable. But
especially in the first tier cities, yeah.
Yeah, it was a tough pill to swallow, I think. Considering in everyone's memory, property could only go up. There was very little downside risk of the principal, and it was a pretty sweet deal. It was such a sweet deal that nobody wanted to even rent out their places that they were buying, and sometimes they wouldn't even bother renovating them. When you hear about these 85 or 90 million unfinished apartments, I think a lot of those were sold as Maopifang, right? There's the concrete structure, and then people figure, well, I'm not going to rent it out right now, so I might as well leave it in this concrete structure state, and then eventually either I'll use it or I'll just keep it as a store of value. So a lot of that's gone away, and I think that feeling flush has gone away. In the U.S., in contrast, the majority of U.S. household wealth, like 70% of it, is in the stock market, right? That's where the U.S. and U.S. stock market is showing all-time highs, and continues to perform really well. So the average American consumer who's in the stock market feels pretty good. But something like 93% of the U.S. stock market is owned by the top 10% wealthiest Americans. So it's not really a fair comparison, because the U.S. has seen its middle class actually contract, because we haven't had real wage increases in the United States since 1974, right? That's something that I don't think is well understood, is that the U.S. middle class, which has paid for this whole party in the U.S., it's been under siege, right? It's the three things that a middle class consumer focuses on most is healthcare, education, and housing. These are the three biggest cost buckets for someone in the middle class, and those costs have been rising at about 6% annually in the U.S. since the 1970s, and wages, inflation-adjusted wages, have not changed in that time. So if you were to plot that out, what you'd create is this enormous gap that was for a while filled in the U.S. by two-income houses, and then second jobs, and then taking reverse mortgages, or taking other forms of debt and loan on to try to pay for it all. And what's ended up happening is it's kind of split off, like what was the 30% of Americans that were in the middle class. It split them up into two categories. You've got one category that's more aligned to the top 1%, and they just have basically plenty of cash to do whatever they want, and they're feeling really good, and they love the U.S. system because it benefits them. And but then the other remaining 20% or so of the U.S. middle class hasn't fared so well. In fact, their kids are having a hard time finding jobs and having a hard time paying for education and that sort of thing. And that's where the U.S. is challenged, but China has a different set of challenges, because China's inflation has been much more reasonable, and their wage inflation has exceeded CPI inflation for all of the last 35 years that I was involved in China, right? So that's that's a model that the U.S. had during its heyday, and China has now. So what China has to do, it has to maintain that proportion where it's able to generate wage increases and jobs of ever greater value as it's controlling costs. And if you look at the tail of the tape, it's controlled its costs far better than most places, and that's where you have countries like Germany and the U.S. complaining about oversupply and questioning the cost bases in China. But China has worked for decades to get its cost basis down because the Chinese consumer is far more demanding on cost value than consumers from the developed West.
Well, I guess that brings us very nicely into my next question. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that China has overcapacity, from what I understand, internally for especially solar panels, EVs to some extent, but also solar panels, really large. It does look like China manufactured more solar panels than domestically it could absorb and install, but a lot of those are now going to the developing world, like Africa and South America and so forth. What do you make of the claims of overcapacity? Is it overcapacity, or is it finally just enough solar panels that the world kind of already needed? What's your opinion?
I mean, based on the targets that that the world has set for a migration to renewable energies and alternative energies, no, there's not an overcapacity. Where there's an overcapacity is there's an overcapacity of supply in some countries versus demand. The U.S. always assumes that when Chinese prices are this low, they can't be making money, and there's got to be, it's got to be subsidies or parlor tricks or sleight of hand or whatever. Because it's hard for us to relate to the China price. It's hard for us to understand what they did to get to the China price. The other thing that they forget is in the West, there's so much cost built into just the system. There's legacy costs, Social Security costs, which the U.S. has an enormous military budget, over $1 trillion in this coming budget. Which is higher, by the way, than the GDP of most countries. Put everything in perspective, what you see is that the U.S., will always see a challenge understanding how China gets to where it got to. And China doesn't have a lot of those legacy costs and things that are just like a tax that are added on to the basic cost of things. They also been very good about reducing costs down the value chain and down the supply chain, which is but the reality is China is now a primarily domestic market-driven economy. It's not primarily driven by exports and by trade and manufacturing designed for exports. So when I think about China and EV, they said, all right, we want to dominate EV. We want to be, in the 21st century, we want to be the equivalent of ExxonMobil and Shell and BP. We want to have those companies here, and we've got a domestic market that we can build on, and we can build it ourselves. And then whatever's left over, the developed West assumes that they're thinking about us, but they're not thinking about us. What they're thinking about is the global South, and they're thinking about all of these countries that, like China, didn't have basic infrastructure to begin with. Developed road networks, developed high-speed rail networks, developed ports and airports, and all of that good stuff. Not to mention digital infrastructure. And China said, if we can leapfrog with 5G right over landlines, let's help Zambia do that. Let's help El Salvador do that. Let's help all these countries do that too, and we can be the ones to supply to them. So when you really look at what countries need, do you know there are countries? I think Ethiopia, they banned all imports of gasoline-powered cars. I think it's Ethiopia. They decided that they wanted to basically create an infrastructure which was dependent on solar power powering electric vehicles. So I think they have a couple of asterisks, but there's a couple of countries out there now that are saying, all right, how do we get in on this thing that China has been able to build very low cost solar cells, the photovoltaic cells, and China's been able to produce very inexpensive cars like the BYD Seal, and we want in on that. And that's really the story. And then after that, it gets to the EU and the US. I mean, frankly, you mentioned the EV tariffs. Are they really going to affect China that much? China never sold any volume of EVs in the US anyway. So
Yeah.
is it really that hurt? Who gets hurt by that? Honestly, who gets hurt by that more? Who has the technology and who needs it? Right? When China needed the technology and the US and Europe had it, what did it do? Well, it put up high tariffs, but then made it really attractive for those companies that couldn't export to China to set up shop in China and build factories. And then they arranged it so that the technology transfer was completely legal and above board. And they were like, hey, you want to be in this market? This is the price of admission. Why doesn't the US do that now? That's what it should be doing. Like, what I would have been much more encouraged to see is, you want to throw 100% tariffs. Obviously, that's overkill. It's about 2 percentage points of market share loss for every 1% tariff, right? And it's a tariff, by the way. It doesn't affect China very much. I mean, yeah, I guess it reduces sales, but what it really does is it's a tax. It's a tax, like kind of like a variation of a value-added tax that the U.S. government would charge an American for the right to own that Chinese car. And so in this case, it's a 100% tariff. That is a tax that goes right to the U.S. government. It goes right to the balance sheet. So that's it.
Well, I wanted to ask, I have a very specific example in mind that I think, as someone who doesn't understand economics particularly well, that looks like a way for the US and China to get along. So, you're talking about companies from the United States coming and setting up in China, or foreign companies like Tesla did in the Gigafactory in Shanghai. But there's a smaller example in the United States. There's a JV in Ohio called Illuminate USA, which is a Chinese company. It's the largest Chinese company, I think, in solar panels. And they're hiring Americans, about 1,000 American workers for factory jobs, which Americans love. It's our favorite kind of job. It's just harkens back to the old times too, when we actually did make things. So these are American workers making solar panels in America for the American economy, but it's a JV with a Chinese company. Do you think that this is the kind of model for Chinese and American cooperation in America?
Yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, I'm writing an article right now which talks about that very plant. I think that plant is a great example of a model that we should be using. The model is where China has a clear and obvious superiority on tech, and where it's clearly a technology that the US does not want to be boxed out of. And it makes perfect sense to do exactly what China did to us, which is to encourage us to invest in factories under a JV scenario and give jobs to Chinese workers and offer, benefits to the local economies, and then, use that as a Trojan horse to have access to the market. And U.S. companies have just made fortunes in China over the last 30 years using that model. It worked very well. It's exactly what the U.S. should be doing right now. In fact, it's one of the 3 recommendations in my article, because I think it's important we understand we're in this time now. Like, we're so busy living in the past when China wasn't really a factor, but now China has more companies in the Fortune Global 500 than we do. So whatever misconceptions people have, they need to get with the reality of the times, which is that we need to be transferring Chinese technology to us now. That's what we should be doing, and we should be doing it like the same way they did it, because they'll understand that model, because the Chinese are incredibly good negotiators, and they'll understand that it made sense on the other side of the table when they were there, and it makes sense on this side of the table where they are now. And whichever side you're on, it's got to make sense for everybody. And I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. But I mean, the truth of the matter is, I think I read that China's external trade accounts for like 38%, if you include the manufacturing, 38% of their GDP. And the US was like 12% of that. So the US is responsible for something around, let's call it 5% directly, and maybe another 5% indirectly because of US dominance in SWIFT and global payments and all of that. So when you add it all together, US is a major factor, but not so big a major factor that we have a superior negotiating position on this. Like, access to our market isn't as important to China as access to growing markets. And the growing markets are where? Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, Central Asia. That's where the markets are. Middle East. That's where the markets are growing. That's where they've got a story to tell, right? Because the US, when you look at the US, you have to remember the US isn't just the US. It's also a country that has allies that are very dependent on it. The economic system, South Korea, Japan, France, UK, these countries that are very much part of the US. So whatever the US does, you should assume that the EU is kind of not far behind, and these other countries are not far behind. So they all run around in a pack. Well, China's running around in a pack, that's BRICS. And behind BRICS is BRI. And so where do you want to be? Do you want to be with 12% of the population and maybe 10 to 20% of global growth, depending on how you calculate it and what your estimates are, versus China, basically dominating foreign trade with 140 countries, right? And in that position that they're in a position where they can afford to be a little bit more ambivalent about how much they rely on the developed world. And I think that they've, when you look back on it, it's been quite obvious that they've been able to lessen. It started around 2008 with the GFC. That's when they started to become disillusioned, I think, with the U.S. and started to think that maybe we'd be better off going all this out alone as opposed to following the U.S. model.
Yeah, I want to change my questions a bit. I wanted to ask you, and I have my own opinion formulated already. The Belt and Road Initiative largely is logistics infrastructure, but if China builds a bridge in Kenya, the U.S. companies can use the same bridge to do business when they're doing business in Kenya. Why do you think the United States is so afraid of BRI if a port that China builds, in Sri Lanka or in somewhere in South America can also be used by U.S. companies?
Well, for one thing, the U.S. was used to, for a long time, being the only game in town, right? So, if a country in South America or in Africa wanted a bridge or a port or whatever, then the World Bank or IMF, somebody would, show up and, here's the deal. There's really no other deal. And by the way, here are the companies lined up to sort of provide this, and we've got these stipulations, and and there was a lot of debt trap diplomacy. It wasn't intentionally. I don't think any country intentionally lends money with the idea that it's going to strangle its borrower. But the idea is, in reality, that happened quite a bit. Regime changes in some of these receiving countries, and that sort of thing. So China has experienced that as well. What the U.S. I think doesn't like is the idea that there's a lot of influence that goes along with BRI, right? And like I mentioned, it's, in one regard, it was just really smart economics. China had a lot of infrastructure construction capacity.
Yeah.
it had to do something with, because its own infrastructure is pretty amazing now, right? It's ranked third in the world. The U.S. is ranked something like 13th or 15th. And it was sort of like, okay, we've got to, what do we do with it? And they decided they could export it. And of course, they create these turnkey models. And of course, but what it's really about is creating little nascent middle class economies in all these countries, right? That's the real goal of BRI. That's what it really does. It allows a country to leapfrog technologies, leapfrog infrastructure to the very latest infrastructure, and it allows them to then, generate all the economic value that can offer. That's really what it does, and it provides air cover for Chinese companies that want to sell into those markets, because you're going to buy from who you're familiar with and who you're seeing a lot. And if you're seeing Chinese companies, building the roads, you're more likely to think about a Chinese company when it's time to buy a TV and so forth. And that's what's so impressive about BRI. It's just been an advertising campaign that's really tough to beat, right? Because
I'm gonna have to cut you off. Last question. We're out of time. This is the most important part of my show. What do continued peace? What are your hopes for continued peace between U.S., China, and the rest of the world? What do you hope is going to provide the stability that continues, bringing us together?
Well, I think China is doing part of it. China has been far more dovish and gentle in in some of its external communications. Certainly since we spoke last, Jason, I think President Xi has been on a real charm offensive with the American business community. November in San Francisco, and then a couple months ago in Beijing. So they're doing that, and maybe a little more constructive on some of his conversations in other areas. They've been they've been pretty busy, right, on their international relations. The U.S., for its part, I think it's still kind of getting used to, like, it's just the hits keep coming really quickly. One day it's Temu is this unstoppable juggernaut, and the next day BYD is overtaking Tesla, and the next day Apple is seeing its market share drop by 10% in China, and these are things that are happening at China speed, right? So a lot of the stability that's going to come in this relationship is going to be when, not the business community, because I think the business community is already pretty familiar with China's speed and China's capabilities. But I think the security apparatus in the U.S. is kind of getting into like a mode where it has to like sort of understand the reality that it does operate within a country that also has other stakeholders. That's what's really happening right now is, both the U.S. and China believe in their own exceptionalism, and that's true for the populations of each of those countries. But also in both countries, the national security apparatus is in both countries are running things. And so that's something that just has to filter through, right? You have to get to the place where maybe it's about national security, but I think the business considerations will be a bigger piece of it in the U.S. for sure going forward. I think China is already a little bit more familiar with how their business activities internationally are supporting their strategic goals, and that's where they're investing. That's where the U.S. has to follow.
Absolutely fascinating conversation. I hope we can have you back. Thank you so much for your time, Mitch Presnick.
Thanks, Jason. Great to be with you. Thanks.